ゲームじゃない感じに仕上げたいっていうような、ゲームなんですけど、ゲームやってたっていう感じよりもなんか違うものが残ってほしいなっていうような、感覚ですかね。僕ほら、例えばゲームっていろんなものがあるし、スポーツゲームもあれば、パズルみたいなのもあるしっていう、そういうものの、なんていう要素をもう何でもかんでも吸収しちゃうようなゲームなところがあるので、ゲームをしてるんだけれども、いろんなことの体験をしてって最後にその物語全部が集約し、一つ終わりを迎えるみたいな、そういうような遊びともつかないしゲームともつかないし、何だったんだろうこれは、なんかその疑似体験としてなんか面白いものを経験しちゃったなみたいな、そういう感覚で終われるものになってくれればいいなといつも思ってますね。だからゼルダは何でも吸収できるし、何をやってもゼルダとも言えるし、うまいことをやらないとゼルダと言ってもらえないみたいな変な側面もあるし、なんかね、変な不思議なゲームです。はい。
Eiji Aonuma's 5 directed Zelda games are a very over-discussed topic, like, in general. For reasons that we're going to get into, it's important to a lot of people to control the narrative about them, which you might also suspect this video is going to be an attempt at. What I would say is that these games are not perfect. They've got filler and problems. Even if they didn't, the medium is still very young, so making grand declarations about it wouldn't be enduring or impressive. So for the longest time, I never felt the need to say anything. But I realize now that most Zelda fans understand small surface level things, but in the end, they just can't see the forest for the trees. The director's intended interpretation ends up getting the same amount of focus and respect that some fan theory would. They like it, they think it's fun, but optional. Some people still believe it to be unfounded. Nobody's as angry as they really should be. They seem to think that everyone is just entitled to their opinion, which is textbook cowardice. I thought that I could organize things a little better, but I really can't afford to. I promise by the end of it, I really do address everything, but I won't explain it in ludicrous detail, because I'm not trying to sell you on a stupid fan theory. None of this is a theory. It's not apologetic in any way, and it isn't my opinion poorly disguised as a retrospective. This is simply The Legend of Zelda as it was intended by Eiji Aonuma. Now, before I say anything about anything, I need to address all the common misconceptions that I possibly can. For Zelda, the very best source of misconceptions is Matthew Matosis, a painfully condescending YouTube critic.
The story sets itself up to be a prequel to every other Zelda game to date, but doesn't accomplish anything with it. The most shocking revelation in the game is that Zelda is actually the reincarnated form of the goddess Hylia, a character who had never even been mentioned before until the intro to Skyward Sword.
Starting with the basics, the very first Zelda timeline was published in this Famitsu article in 1991. Eiji Aonuma was hired in 1988, but wouldn't join the Zelda team until the absolute earliest, 1996. A Link to the Past is mostly Takashi Tezuka's game, but the game's manual was written by Koizumi, who would later go on to co-direct the 64 Zeldas and direct the first 3 3D Mario titles. So the timeline in this article is most likely by Koizumi.
Okay, so you've got Zelda 3 at the top, and then it says the original Zelda makes her first appearance. And then it also says Link's ancestor, ? Then after that, it just says Nagai Nengetsu, I think, which is just like a long period of years and months. That's all it is.
It's interesting here that Koizumi is saying A Link to the Past is a time jump prequel to Zelda 1. Aonuma must have really loved this idea, because when he was brought on, he repeated it. Twice. When we get into later the boundaries of Aonuma's creative control, this will be an important thing to go back over because it shows the line between what he inherited and how he retooled it to fit his purposes. In 2002, following the release of The Wind Waker, Aonuma would give this quote in a GamePro article. The GamePro article itself is lost to time from what I can tell, but it's been archived in this issue of Nintendo Power. Where does The Wind Waker fit in the overall Legend of Zelda timeline? In terms of the storyline, we've decided that this takes place 100 years after the events in Ocarina of Time. We think that as you play through the game, you'll notice that the beginning of the story explains some of the events in Ocarina of Time. You'll also find hints of things from Ocarina of Time that exist in The Wind Waker. There's also a more complicated explanation. If you think back to the end of Ocarina of Time, there were 2 endings in that game in different time periods. First, Link defeated Ganon as an adult, and then he actually went back to being a child. You could say that The Wind Waker takes place 100 years after the ending in which Link was an adult. Now that's pretty descriptive on its own, but if you need proof of his consistency on this issue, he says a similar thing in Nintendo Dream number 154, which was transcribed and archived to Ninja.com in 2006. Fair warning, I can't read Japanese, and Google Translate doesn't handle this very well. Windtact is parallel. Isn't it back to the childhood when Link flies to the world 7 years later at Ocarina and defeats Ganon? Twilight Princess is a world 100 and several years after a peaceful childhood. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Link and Princess Zelda come back as children to have a conversation. It is this story that the story's result is a little dragging that the relationship between the three with Ganon goes in different directions. In the middle of the work, there's a scene where Ganon is executed. If you leave him alone, he will be executed because he is a sacker to do ridiculous things later. So that scene is a few years after Ocarina. So the executed Ganon was sent to a world and this time trying to get that power. There's plenty of old message boards of people reacting to the Famitsu article getting published elsewhere, most famous of which is AVGN's video, which he published on Cinemassacre.com in 2009. It's so weird to me that timeline deniers nowadays try to retroactively say that the chronology was somehow made up for Hyrule Historia in 2011. It's something that Aonuma had discussed for 2 decades at that point, and everybody else at the time was clamoring about it. It's probably the easiest lie to disprove that you could think of. I also found a Reddit post showing a magazine from October 2011 out of context in order to say that the timeline still isn't official. Meanwhile, Hyrule Historia released in December 2011. So it was a secret in October, but by December it was no longer a secret. I don't think that anyone actually bought this one, but I thought I would mention it while we're here because it's pretty funny.
At the start of the Minish Cap, there's an opening sequence detailing a previous incarnation of Link and shows that he wasn't wearing a hat. In the grander scheme of the Zelda timeline, the Minish Cap was basically an origin story for Link's hat, which was a fun idea. It was executed extremely well, and by the end of the game it was nice to know that the hats of the various Links worn through the years were a sort of unknowing tribute to Ezlo. Skyward Sword undoes the entire point of this game. If Skyward Sword actually cared at all about being faithful to the timeline, then Link wouldn't be wearing a hat, which would have been an extremely easy change to make, and might have even made his design more interesting.
I won't get into this too much in this video because we're focusing on Eiji Aonuma's directed Zelda games and his story intentions for them. But yes, he does include games on his chronology that he had zero involvement in, and that much is a little confusing, understandably. I'm not going to say that these games aren't canon to each other, but if you think about it, or even if you don't, there's no possible way that these games could ever have any significant story connection. That's not what the timeline is about. The timeline is about how Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword all would connect to Ocarina and Majora. As Eiji Aonuma developed his story, these were the only parts that he was really concerned about. There's 100-year time jumps between each hero, stretching 200 years. And the implication when you create any story with time jumps is that the events in between aren't significant. Nothing can happen after Ocarina of Time for a while because Ganon is sealed away, and etc., etc. So these other games on the timeline, again, I'm not saying they aren't canon, but they are superfluous, which is supported by the fact that nobody ever mentions the Minish or Vadi or any of that stuff. None of this is confusing as long as you have a basic comprehension of time travel and you don't poke holes in it like a contrarian.
If they use the same logic as the Song of Storm scenario, then the plants would always be grown in the future because the game would assume that young Link would plant them in the past. If the Song of Storm scenario worked by the logic used on the plants, then the guy couldn't possibly have taught Link the song in the future until young Link played it in the past. Basically, all of this is to say that the time travel in Ocarina of Time probably wasn't thought out to a huge degree, and the developers simply went with whatever they thought was a good idea for certain parts of the game. When you look at the Magic Beans and the Song of Storms, they're both good ideas and I like the way they play with the time travel. The problem is they're incompatible with each other.
What Matthew really wants when he says that Minish Cap is a better prequel than Skyward Sword is for fans to be able to make creative changes to the story, and not the person directly responsible for that story. And well, that's problematic.
The reveal that Tetra is Zelda is perhaps the least thought out moment in any Zelda story ever. As soon as she's revealed to be the princess, the King of Red Lion starts referring to her as Zelda for no reason. Presumably names in the Zelda universe work the same way they do in the real world. Presumably Tetra has been going by the name Tetra for as long as she's been alive. It's even left ambiguous about whether or not she knew about her heritage at all, so why then is she suddenly renamed Zelda as soon as she discovers her lineage? This alone might not seem so bad, maybe we could assume that her name was Zelda all along and Tetra just an alias, but her clothes are suddenly replaced and she seems to undergo a complete personality change. She's no longer a freewheeling, aggressive pirate, but suddenly seems to be a refined, caring princess. Even if we go out on a limb and assume that Zelda's personality somehow awakened inside of Tetra, then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself. It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten.
Does it not occur to Matthew that just because an event takes place later in the story, that doesn't necessarily mean that the storyteller came up with it later? I mean, think about it. Even if you don't know anything about Zelda, this information is obviously important to the ending of the game. He says that this moment isn't thought out, but he doesn't provide any evidence for that claim. Does he know who created the story? Can he provide evidence that they didn't think about it? Obviously not. He's just saying that to him, the scene doesn't feel like it was thought out. By definition, this can't be a shoehorn if that's what he always planned to do. I mean, it's made up, but everything's made up. So yeah, Tetra isn't real, Zelda isn't real. These are fictional stories. Again, what is this guy even talking about?
The more likely answer is this is simply a shoehorned reference to Ocarina of Time, one of many that are in the Wind Waker for seemingly no reason at all. There's no time travel in the Wind Waker, Link has no connection to the previous one apart from his clothes, the game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. Overall, the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced, and the Koroks and the Rito are the two worst examples. The idea of setting a game and was essentially a post-apocalyptic scenario of Hyrule is wonderful, but its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out.
It's pretty inappropriate to say that the races in Wind Waker need to have firmer connections to their Ocarina counterparts in order to be a fitting conclusion to the story. Their connections are loose on purpose. They had to endure the onslaught of a reawakened Ganon and then a giant flood. It's completely believable that they'd lose the majority of those ties. Actually, this is just a total misunderstanding of not only the plot, but also the themes and morals of the game. The point that Aonuma is trying to make with the Wind Waker, generally speaking, is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. All the people, Hylians, Rito, Koroks, they've shed their connections to the old world, and now live in peace above the waves, just as the gods wanted. Ganon insists that this was a cop-out, and that the gods refused to save their people, but it's not true. They did what they could. Ganon's whole motivation in this game is to destroy the new world in wake of reviving the old one. He's trading all of his tomorrows for a single yesterday, and defending himself to the detriment of the rest of the world. And you don't need an art book recapping that information to understand it properly. It's explicitly told to you in dialogue. And again, none of this is a fan theory. It's just what's in the games. Going back to what I said earlier about extraneous titles, Matt even complains about Phantom Hourglass for this very reason.
The ending to the game sees Hyrule washed away with the kids' future left in their own hands. We know now that the story continues on in two direct sequels to the Wind Waker, those being Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, but taken on its own, I think this would have made a fitting ending to the entire Zelda saga. Games could have still been set before the Wind Waker to allow the series to continue, and some are, but the Wind Waker itself would have made a nice conclusion to the series as a whole. Ganon, Hyrule and the Master Sword are all lost beneath the waves, and life moves on. It would have made for a nice ending.
He catches it here. But again, he's only applying this logic when it suits his opinion.
It would almost be as incredibly stupid as the King of Hyrule passionately telling the children at the end of the Wind Waker that their new land won't be Hyrule, because he wanted the past washed away. And then, within a few years, they discover a new continent. Guess what they call it?
Adding any kind of character depth or world building or some other literal element, you might take that as an improvement to the story, but actually it makes it less concise. Instead of it being about this emotional tug and pull about the morality of family versus future, you're erasing that and just boiling Hyrule down into any other fantasy world that you would use to escape your adult responsibilities. The point is instead to take these morals to heart and apply them to your adult life. Lorne Lanning, I think, is one of the first game developers to actually take himself seriously. In the 90s, he was forced to make a bunch of games out of contract, but now that he's gotten out of that contract, he's finally self-publishing, so he can take his time between releases. Most developers, like Eiji Aonuma for example, don't have that luxury, because the authority of an artist's influence on a work is considered a threat to the authority of a corporation who only sees art as an entertainment product. Which is especially pernicious in computer games, because the entire industry right now is centered around the idea that games are only escapist toys. When Lanning conceived Oddworld basically as a movie, he turned the idea into a video game for budgeting reasons.
That's amazing. Let's make 5 movies. And I was like, no, we're going to make 5 games because 5 movies is going to cost at least $500 million. And who's going to give us that? Nobody. But we could get maybe $25 million to make 5 games at less than $5 million a piece. And she was like, oh, you suck. You're just like, I just have no interest in making games. I win awards and I make movies and I love films and games is just violence and it's this and that. I was like, games is a lot of things and it's going to be a lot more things and you don't really know. None of us can tell what it's going to be yet. But ride this with me for a second. This is what's going to happen. These systems are going to come in, it's going to change the medium, and you know what? The medium of games, they don't know how to do large productions yet. They don't know how to manage 150 people on a team, but we do. So we have that going for us.
Executives don't expect as much out of game devs as they do movie directors, which afforded him a lot of leniency. Some would probably be offended by the idea that games could be treated as though they were low-budget movies, but this approach allowed him to pioneer, while also cheating his homework off of the movies that he really liked. I'm not going to say that presentation isn't important, because it is important, but as far as getting your foot in the door, most people will just take what they can get. The people who end up pushing the frontier of technologies, in the beginning they were just industrious storytellers who wanted to have their story told, by whatever means necessary. They're just trying to get their point across, the story, of course, being the ultimate point.
I'm not fond of the heavy emphasis on story in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, as I think it all too often breaks up the gameplay and gets in the way of the whole reason people play the games in the first place. The story never really should be the draw, just a little something to urge the player on.
Because when I talk at length about why the story in The Legend of Zelda is so important, I'm not talking out of my ass. This is the entire reason Eiji Aonuma became a developer. This is the entire reason most people become artists. It's the singular thing that they wanted to do. So yes, Zelda games exist as stories first, and games second, which, by the way, isn't a flaw, it's a strength.
All the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced. Its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out. Then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself.
What Matt is really trying to say is that he believes that there's no way Aonuma could have possibly cared or kept track of all these things, but as I'm gonna show, Aonuma absolutely did keep track of the details. Speaking of details, let's look at another character who has his true identity revealed to him.
This section of the game is where the Zant stuff finally goes off the rails. He had only been seen rarely before this point, but he was shown to be a restrained and creepy villain who managed to be pretty intimidating. Had they kept this up, he could have easily substituted as Ganon for the game's main villain. Zant's character is flushed down the drain in the space of a minute, and it turns out he's just another boss to defeat on the path to the real villain, Ganon. I don't think there was any point to establishing Zant as a villain at all if he was going to be replaced at the end of the game with Ganondorf.
I'm not going to harp on it too much right now, but you should at the very least understand that all fictional characters are nothing more than metaphors, and they are, in fact, at the disposal of the larger story.
Freewheeling, aggressive pirate, strained and creepy villain who... It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten. Zant's character is flushed down the drain.
This isn't a flaw, it's just how stories have been told for thousands of years. A fun, unique side character is never going to take precedent over the larger story. I'm going over many interview quotes later, of course, but you don't have to know the entire history of everything to understand that Eiji Aonuma is the originator for these story concepts. That much is self-evident if you simply read one or two interviews, because he's always the one that gives detailed and lengthy answers to story questions, talking about things he could only know if he was.
Tetra allows Link to get on board the pirate ship, and by this point you've probably figured out that she's Zelda. In Ocarina of Time they pulled this trick as well, but it was far more unexpected because Sheik was so different from how you would imagine Zelda to be, and because they hadn't had a twist like that before. Nobody who played Ocarina was about to be fooled twice. It's not a big deal, but it begs the question of why they even bothered, or why they didn't try to do something a bit different. This is a tough balance to maintain, however, and after the complaints from some people that Majora's Mask and the Wind Waker were too different, it was probably inevitable that Nintendo would eventually produce something too close to the Ocarina of Time mold. Back in the days of Ocarina and Majora, Nintendo clearly didn't care about crafting an overarching timeline for the Zelda series.
As I've been showing, at no point in these videos does Matt have any curiosity about the storytelling purposes of anything. He has a hunch that Tetra being Zelda wasn't thought out, but he never did any research, or he would find out that he was wrong. He also has a hunch that Tetra and Zant were originally meant to carry over into the third act of the story, replacing Zelda and Ganondorf, but he never did any research, or he would have found out he was wrong. And he keeps droning on about how Nintendo did this or Miyamoto did that. He's just making it abundantly clear that he has no insight on who actually came up with the story that he hates so much. The only way that anyone could miss important details like this, like Tetra obviously always being Zelda, or Zant obviously always being Ganondorf's heir, is by completely missing the intended reading of the text, which you can either do unintentionally because you misunderstand the story at face value, or intentionally to mislead people even though you actually do understand the overarching story. Now, which one does Matt fit into? You might be shocked.
According to the story, the world was formed by three goddesses who are also responsible for creating the Triforce. This story has no bearing on the game in the slightest and could have been swapped out with any mystical backstory you could think of. We don't get any reason why the Triforce itself would exist, just that it was left behind after they were gone. These events are so far removed from the things that actually happen in the game that they might as well have not been included. I'm all for fleshing out the world, but this doesn't tell us anything about Hyrule or any of the people living in it that we didn't already know. It just confirms that some goddesses made the world, not a big deal.
Now, I could nerd about this, but then he skips over the part where Zelda recaps it later. And then when Ganon seizes the Sacred Realm, like they had been talking about the entire time, he says this.
The Ocarina of Time opens up the Temple of Time, where the game will skip forward 7 years into the future. There's a bit of an unnecessary cutscene where Ganon tells how this was his plan all along, blah blah blah, and then a bit more exposition.
Just as it was in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, none of this stuff is optional to the story of Ocarina of Time. Matt wants to have his cake and eat it too, where he can ignore the story, because according to him it doesn't matter, but then when the story reaches a climax, and suddenly all of those things do gain relevance, suddenly it's this weird thing that comes out of nowhere. The truth is, it never came out of nowhere. Matt just wasn't paying attention. Like, check this one out.
But this is just one element of a much larger game, and regardless of how you feel about the visuals, it's worth considering how well the Wind Waker stands up as a Zelda game, and as a game in general. It starts out on the appropriately named Outset Island with
No, it doesn't start on Outset Island. I mean, you know full well that it doesn't. This intro explains all the supposed problems that Matt has with this story, and this is on the GameCube version where you can't even skip the cutscenes, so you've had to deliberately edit that footage out of your recording. I can't believe people take this guy seriously when he thinks that he can make a 40-minute video claiming to have some kind of insight on The Legend of Zelda. Meanwhile, every single blasted thing he says about this story doesn't contain any information in it. Matt, not only are you missing the entire point of the whole story, You're doing it on purpose. You know what the story is. You've proven that you know.
We're told that Ganon has basically won. He's got his hands on the Triforce and took over the Sacred Realm. Link got sealed away for 7 years so he could grow old enough to take him on. From here on out, most of the game is played as adult Link in the future, and it's a great idea for the plot. In most action-adventure style games that revolve around saving the world, you're given some idyllic place that needs protection, or a post-apocalyptic world where the struggle of the people compels you to try and help them. Either of these scenarios can only be so effective because we're left wondering about what exactly it is we're trying to prevent, or what exactly it is we're trying to restore. As soon as you walk into Hyrule Town 7 years on, Ocarina of Time has answered both of these questions. You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now.
You have very good reading comprehension. Just because from Tetra's point of view all of this is mysterious, that doesn't mean the player doesn't know who Zelda is. Tetra wasn't alive 100 years ago. She obviously doesn't know who Zelda is. That doesn't mean that this moment is out of character. We, the audience, do know who Zelda is. Her name's on the title screen. The only reason you wouldn't apply this logic to the Wind Waker is if you were being deliberately disingenuous to serve your opinion.
You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now. Well, not as we know it anyway. And what it does look like now.
But as previously established, the moral at the end of The Wind Waker is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. Twilight Princess, being an alternate ending to the story, is now inverting that moral. Now, Link is the one protecting his heritage and saving his family, and Ganondorf is the one creating a future for himself in spite of his past. The shoe's on the other foot, but interestingly, Ganondorf is still in the wrong. This is the thematic purpose behind the timeline. At this point, I really have no patience for the people who pretend like the timeline is inconsequential or confusing, because its purpose here is obvious. Twilight Princess is a poetic inversion of Wind Waker. That's the whole reason that they're both sequels to Ocarina of Time. Now you're able to explore, on an emotional level, both sides of the same coin. It's fun and interesting, and it's very sad that a lot of people just can't be bothered. But anyway, how does Aonuma pull all this off? Well, Zant is the key here. Notice that Zant doesn't have to beg Ganondorf for powers or anything. Ganondorf actually comes up to Zant. Let's think about this for 2 seconds. Why Zant? Well, Zant must be special, right? Remember how Tetra is the next Zelda after her mother? Well, here, Zant is the heir to the Lost Gerudo Patriarchy. He's the third male Gerudo after Groose. Once again, this stuff would be totally obvious if Matt simply read the text on screen. You know, thank God it's actually on screen this time. If this was really a retrospective, like it says in the title, wouldn't it contain information that Matthew would only have access to in retrospect? You know, like an art book that explains the story in black and white detail. But no, just to make sure he's been contrarian to every single point made by Hyrule Historia, since that's the true reason he made these videos, he's going to insist that Zant was always supposed to be the main villain of Twilight Princess. With no evidence, mind you. I mean, seriously? I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but you don't have to make fun of these videos. They just make fun of themselves.
It may be a case they only made this decision because they knew many players would be replaying the game and thus would be ready for hard mode, but I hope they seriously consider this for the next Zelda. At the end of the game, you're taking on multiple Darknuts at once, who do several hearts of damage if they manage to connect.
There's a concerted effort by Matt to overgeneralize and downplay everything, not just the story. He's constantly acting like he's too good for the game. And if that's how you feel about video games, that they should have to earn your attention and respect, you know, that's a matter of personal taste. You can like whatever you want, but don't delude yourself into thinking that attitude makes you superior to everyone else. Now, like I said, most fans these days already know most of this. Matthew is a huge outlier. But at the end of the day, even the fans who are aware just aren't seeing the bigger picture, so we need to keep zooming out. And there's a huge prerequisite before you can truly appreciate Twilight Princess as the first proper revision to Zelda's chronology.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a fun playthrough. Anyone here never see this? Also, thank you for the host, Mike. Hi, everybody. Oh, so there's a lot of people who have never played this game. I think you'll enjoy this. This is going to be one of those playthroughs I think you might remember for a little while. Not because of me, but because of the game. It's just one of those games. So, really nice look at the world. For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities and sword. And horse, and bridge, and castle. And bow, and climbing. Oh, and Zelda is in this. And Link. And Epona. And Ganon. Alright, I'll stop.
Fumito Ueda is intentionally pulling from Eiji Aonuma in multiple important points in both Ico and in Shadow of the Colossus. And Eiji Aonuma is intentionally pulling from Fumito Ueda in multiple important parts in Twilight Princess, in Skyward Sword, and even as early as The Wind Waker. So, no, Vinny, their similarities are not superficial. Ico was essentially a love letter to Ocarina of Time, and Shadow of the Colossus has a load of distinctly intentional references to Majora's Mask. Aonuma's referencing Ueda as a reciprocation of Ueda's own references to him. This is about two artists coming to an emotional agreement about something. The comparison currently on screen alone proves that they were not only good friends and have a strong relationship, but that they were actively bouncing ideas off of one another and making notes in each other's margins. Comparing side by side like this isn't revealing something shallow like their favorite flavor of ice cream, it's corroborating evidence of their authority in their own work. The big one that I always think of is this one, the spiral staircase inside the tower. Aonuma wants you to think about Yorda from Ico, and he wants you to compare Yorda in that game to Zelda's role in this game. A pale, fragile girl hiding in the shadows. And that's exactly why Ganondorf's first phase is fighting Zelda as a puppet. Now, some fans have suggested that the Twilight could have come from the Gerudo, but from what I can tell, no. They don't understand that this was the intended interpretation. A lot of people, including Vinny, watch the pre-Lakebed Temple flashback and assume that these interlopers are some new group of people that we've never heard of. I'm not joking, they actually take the explanation of the series' largest retcon at face value. They don't get that Midna's hair color is meant to be reflective of Twin Rova. They don't get that Midna's dialogue before the fight reflects what Naboru tells you as a child. And they especially don't understand that Zant being a male Gerudo and wanting to reestablish the patriarchy is what all of this dialogue was always about. There is a pretty good video by Max Darrett where he talks about all the Gerudo's dark magic stuff, and how in both Zelda and in Ico, there's a focus of this dark transformation magic and body horror. But again, most of that is the bleeding edge of the fandom, and even he doesn't get into everything. Again, none of that is a fan theory, and it's not inconsequential. It's the way that the director of both Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess intended the audience to interpret their connected story, also known as canon, official. It's not a mystery, It's not hidden, and it's required for properly understanding the story. These 5 Zelda games really aren't that dense with story, and like I keep saying, they explicitly tell you this stuff in dialogue. The way that Fumito Ueda approached the problem is that he set it up so that the dialogue would not be necessary, kind of like a silent movie. And Eiji Aonuma reciprocated that idea, making Wind Waker more cinematic and expressive, and yeah, also including a fictional language system. Aonuma's games still mostly require dialogue because of his background, but you can see, even down to the plot details, all of this is important, like how Ganon is taking girls to the Forsaken Fortress because they have yellow hair. Exactly how Aiko is taken to the Queen's Castle because he's a boy with horns. These kinds of traditions of sacrifice to ward off evil are pretty essential to Shintoism, and I really shouldn't have to tell you that Shintoism is important to something created in Japan. So as you can see, Zelda's connections to Aiko and Aiko's connections to Zelda are not optional pieces of this analysis. Even in Vinny's case, I actually don't think he meant to say that Aiko and Zelda aren't connected, and what he really meant was just for chat to not watch the gameplay expecting Zelda, which is a good primer.
For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities and sword. And horse, and bridge, and castle.
But when he recognizes the Bridge of Elden quote, as he's watching it, you can tell he instantly regretted the way he worded it. Although, why Vinny didn't notice the Lost Woods quotes from earlier, I have absolutely no clue. And he also didn't apologize after realizing he was wrong, he just turned it into a joke.
Oh, and Zelda is in this. And Link, and Epona. And Ganon. Alright, I'll stop.
This was an opportunity for him to share some actual media literacy with a crowd of 1,000 people watching live, and he passed it up. Vinny plays and talks about video games for a living, and he couldn't be bothered to at least mention the connection he just made. This doesn't just apply to Vinny. If you're a professional Nintendo fan and you didn't know that Zelda takes cues from the Ico series, I'm not going to say that that's okay, because I don't think it's okay. These ideas don't come from nowhere, and they're not meant to seem as if they do. The only reason the Nintendo fans don't know any of this is because all their gaming experience exists in a bubble.
I feel like right now, in the early days of Switch, that's what you're seeing, is that there's people who have the Switch and are hungry for games to play.
Well, how big is it?
The
How big
audience?
is the audience?
Exactly.
What is it? 2 million units?
2 million
yeah,
is
right,
what
'cause that's what they wanted
the
to hit by.
original launch
Yeah,
would
yeah.
have been.
So let's take 2 million units,
Yeah.
right? Now, do you ever sell in 10% of the install base?
Supposedly, Switch has a crazy attach rate with the
Well,
with
that's because
Zelda
there's
and then-
so few available. One of the highest IPs of all time, right? Nintendo first party will deliver IPs that the Nintendo audience is just frothing for, right? So they'll have the highest attach rate of any new console with their own specific IPs, Zelda and Mario.
And get them to go get it in the same way like Limbo did. Where Limbo, hey, I'm only on Xbox, this is great. And by the time I got to PlayStation 4, everybody snapped it up.
And I think it's a great comparison, and it's true. And how many cases will that happen for? No, really. Who really, by the end of the life of the Wii, who else was making money on the Wii aside from Nintendo? How many titles sold for the Wii that weren't Nintendo first party?
Sure.
Okay. So what happened? So they started basically evaporating third-party support, right? And we get to Wii U. What happened? Same.
No third parties, yeah.
How well are other developers, first party, third party, indie, how well are they going to bring titles over? Not very well, because they're going to have to spend more time, energy, and effort to get it onto that console for an underpowered console that's going to have fewer units in the marketplace. So they'll have an unusually high attach rate.
Right.
But what's the chance of anyone else after the initial launch, right? Because the first
Well, now
thing,
as the store fills up,
if there's only 3 titles available,
Yeah.
you're probably going to sell super high attachment rate, right? But as soon as 10 are available, how are you going to do?
Yeah,
As soon as 20 are available, how are you going to do? Which is really the metric, right? If you didn't
Yeah.
make it day one, you're in the higher numbers of competitive stuff. So there could be some advantages for some people, but overall, it's going to add up to the same thing: smaller portfolio on the library. Period. At the end of the day, the catalog is going to be this when it could have been this. You would have thought that maybe if there's no games for sale on a network, if people have a hardware device, maybe they'd like to know that a game has become available.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that, in a silly me.
Yeah.
If you grew up with Nintendo, there's a good chance you never leave Nintendo, and more crucially, you never actually grow up. Instead of complaining that Skyward Sword was boring, what people at the time should have said is how bold it actually is. And no, I'm not saying that out of any kind of bias. This is one of the key things that holds video games back from being appreciated as narrative art, because all the art intellectuals think that video games are merely toys, and all the gamers are only interested in the toy-like qualities of the games they play. Now, despite being a frequenter of channels like Narrel or Matthew Matosis or AVGN, Vinny really hasn't been influenced by common misconceptions with Zelda's story, which makes him the perfect example in this scenario. Vinny plays these games correctly. He slows down, he reads all the NPC dialogue like signposts, and the result speaks for itself.
It goes like this. All right, there's 3 separate timelines that branch off of Ocarina of Time. So, here's how it goes. I want to explain it because it's very interesting. I just learned some more little details in Hyrule Historia. So, 3 different timelines. In one of the timelines, when Ocarina ends, Link goes back to being a child. That's the ending that we see. And as a child, Link goes to Princess Zelda, which the game then freezes. Like you'll see, it says it's speculated in one section, and then in another section it says it's confirmed. So, yeah. But listen, so Link and Zelda, they meet again at the very end of Ocarina of Time in the castle courtyard, and Link now has the mark of the Triforce on his hand. So he tells Zelda what's about to happen, and Zelda says, well, look, you need to go far away. You need to go someplace else because Ganondorf is going to be looking for you, and he wants to access the Sacred Realm. So, Zelda tells the king. They find out that, Ganondorf was a cunt, and they decide to get rid of him. Many years down the road, they execute him. That's in Twilight Princess. But here's what happened to Link. Link wandered off into the forest without a fairy. He was looking for Navi. It was the Lost Woods. And what really happened in Majora's Mask doesn't say for a fact, doesn't say that Link was in fact, in this dream world of his regret and his, problems. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it's implied. And, Navi didn't get lost. Navi flies away. At the end of Ocarina of Time, Navi just flies away. And in the beginning of Majora, you see that Link is looking for a friend. And he's obviously in the woods, and it's highly speculated that, say if Majora did happen, let's just say it did, if it was real, if there really was a parallel universe that Link went to and returned from, well, that Link was forever forgotten. No one knew about the Hero of Time. No one celebrated the Hero of Time in this particular timeline. And his regret over that, as it states in Hyrule Historia, allowed him to be the swordsman whose sole purpose was to teach the new Link of Twilight Princess the moves that he knew as a way to pass down his legacy. Just to further add to that, in Hyrule Historia, it's directly stated that the Hero of Time, was never to be seen or heard from again after Majora's Mask. So, isn't this stuff really interesting? Like, I love this stuff, the theories. And it seems like Majora was the deepest and had the most psychological stuff going on there. So, and there you go. Tingle is a representation of Link. Tingle is a mutation of Link. Because he's a 40-year-old man dressed as a fairy. Which again is representative of the child-adult theme. So, I don't know if any of this is true, but I love it. I love talking about it. It's very interesting. So the hero is successful, and the adult era, Ganondorf is revived, Hyrule is sealed and flooded. Because the hero wasn't even around, I don't think. I I have to read into that a little bit more. I haven't gotten to the Wind Waker section yet. And then there's the one, like I said, with Majora, where he's a kid and goes back to being a kid. I know it's a little bit to wrap your head around, but it is exceedingly interesting.
When I watched this in 2015, I was enthralled. I had a lot of fun revisiting Zelda with Vinny's Wii U streams, and then playing them on my own. At the age of 14, I hadn't played Skyward Sword yet, and I hadn't read Hyrule Historia, but I did watch Vinesauce, and that was my introduction to all this. I'm gonna criticize a popular streamer, but know that I do so with peace and love. I really don't think that Vinny is stupid, although he can be impatient sometimes. You can see here that when he applies himself, he's actually an enormous asset to media literacy. I'm also not the first person to ever complain about this reactionary approach to story-driven games over the years, and it's not an irrelevant issue either. It's been happening recently. Vinny's also very touchy about this stuff, and it's weird because he says one thing and he does another. But yeah, I'm gonna fully concede here. Yes, this is about loyalty and authority, and I'm going to address that directly. Just because fiction isn't real, that doesn't mean that it's a lie or that it doesn't mean anything. In the end, art is what you make it out to be. If you're not receptive to it, you won't understand. If you laugh at it like it's a joke, then that's all you're allowing it to be for you. That's your choice. So, to understand something from the perspective of the person who created it, you have to drink the Kool-Aid, at least a little bit. I think this is such a sticking point for a lot of gamers, not just Vinny, because they latch onto this false idea of player autonomy and quote-unquote freedom. That feeling that you have when you're immersed in an artist's world is not freedom, it's surrender. There's only one correct way to play a video game, and when you do, you feel free because you feel like your actions are your own. But video games are a curated experience, in truth. Even though there is no freedom, it doesn't make the sensation any less powerful. The truth is that no matter what game you're playing, the player is never in control of their experience. There is no such thing as a linear game. Gameplay first and open world are not genres, they're marketing buzzwords, and they always have been. If you're someone who truly enjoys open world level design, I have to stress that you are not being entertained by an artist's imagination. You're just caught up in your own. If you do something unintended, then that's a glitch, not a design element. The player might be in control of certain small actions, but at no point in any game are you in control of what context those actions can be applied, which is why level design is the single most important aspect of game design, and what ultimately controls the language of the medium. Eiji Aonuma isn't just the originator for the story concepts, he's also a level designer. So when you're discussing whether or not video games are art, or how relevant information in a cutscene should be to the more involved or gameplay parts, he's an important person to ask that question to, because his Zelda games are the result of those exact experiments. Believing in artistic authority is not a bias, and it's not dogma. Like, let's go back to Fumito Ueda. He respected Aonuma because rather than reinventing the wheel, Ueda wanted to pay his respect to who came before him. With the PS1, there was this huge explosion of artists and early speculators into the medium. Hideo Kojima and Lorne Lanning both signed up for the PlayStation because finally their work wouldn't have to be treated as simple toys, and they could be appreciated properly.
What was also on the horizon was Sony PlayStation. So Sony was saying, we're going to get into the game business. And that was kind of out there a couple years before the PlayStation launch, at least. And that's when I thought, this is really going to get interesting, because for the first time, we're going to have a real, true entertainment company get into the game business as a player, and not just a toy company. And that's how I saw Sega and Nintendo, was toy companies. And I don't mean that in any derogatory or condescending way. I just meant they saw their market, and they didn't believe in things like sequels. Check this out, right? So we're going around and talking to game publishers and stuff, and I'm trying to tell them how we're going to build a series, and because I'm just following, like, what does X-Files do? What did Disney do? What is the sequels? Is all Hollywood's about. In games, they were thinking, and this is in 1993, 94, 95, they're going, there's no money in sequels. The sequel only sells at best half as much as the original hit, so we don't really bank on it. And I saw that, I was like, there's one of our moments. There's one of my George Lucas, Walt Disney moments. They don't believe in sequels, which means they don't believe in brand, which means they still thinking about it like it's the toy industry. You know, you come out with Cabbage Patch Kid, but you can't milk it to death, right? Barbie lasts forever, Hot Wheels lasts forever, Legos lasted forever, but everything else tends to be largely come and go. So the toy industry thought more in this way of, you come up with a toy, if it can be a hit, you ride it, you milk that cow for all it's worth, and then you got to come up with a new one. And games was still thinking that way.
Like I said earlier, this is the entire reason that people like this became developers and became artists. It was always what was most important to them and what they wanted to do with their lives. The consistent problem in all these cases is that life isn't simple. We're going to get into later one of the main causes of life's problems, but you should immediately understand that Abe's Odyssey, Ico, and the first Metal Gear are all extremely unfinished games, and their sequels don't fare any better. These games don't accurately reflect the artists that truly made them. As a direct result, the audience that gained an attachment and became fans of their earlier work when they couldn't do what they wanted almost always developed mistaken impressions. These games were never gameplay first or open world or whatever buzzword everybody just latched onto last year. These fans preferred when the story had less prominence, not because their perceived insights were correct, but because they're so insecure that they can't confront their emotions, even in fiction. They inherently hate anything that challenges their comprehension, and especially challenges their patience, and they prove how insecure they are with how they behave.
This one is a sequel to Ocarina of Time, but wait, not a sequel to the end where adult Link defeats Ganon, no, it's a sequel to young Link after he got sent back. So now, any speculation of Nintendo ever making a sequel to Zelda 2 is deader than shit. They can't even make a sequel that follows in consecutive order. Instead, they just keep going back, and then maybe taking a small step up again, and then back again. We have a sequel to the original, a prequel to the original, a sequel to the prequel, a prequel to the prequel, and a sequel to the young Link of the prequel's prequel. What the fuck?
Actually, this clip of James Rolfe is a perfect example about what I'm talking about here, because he wants a direct sequel to Zelda 2. He wants the story to continue in one direction. First of all, let me just say that that was never going to happen, because before Ocarina of Time, the story of Zelda that was being told was nowhere near deep enough to actually support that, which is directly why Tezuka and Koizumi immediately ran away from that as soon as they possibly could.
They don't understand yet. It's going to be brand IP and sequels. But that means it's got to be deeper, richer universes. And in the shit you're currently delivering, I understand why you don't believe in sequels. Because that story sucked. No one gives a fuck about your story because it sucks. If it wasn't good play, your character sucks because you don't have any character development. And so I was very critical of what the characters were in games. Not that I wasn't enjoying them, but when you put it up to a Hollywood standard of character development, character arc, what's happening across the multi-act structure, you had a whole different analysis of what constituted a popular character. So does Mario turn into a good movie? It's a fucking terrible movie, right? It's a terrible movie because it's not there to begin with, right? Does Ratchet and Clank make a good movie? I love Insomniac. Why would you make a movie out of Ratchet and Clank? How deep is the fabric of those characters? How many other game movies did we just give no depth that we expect from movies? So they brought to the movie the same superficiality that's in the game, except what they had the game going for it was good challenge. Now it's just a challenge to watch, right? So for me, I was like, if we build really rich characters with really rich, deep stories that aren't what you expect, so they have the ability to possibly cut through, then they might have a longer life. And as the game industry matures, then maybe they can hit the big time. Then maybe they can, really have their name in lights.
What James really wants when he says that he wants a sequel to Zelda 2 is for the story to be an unimportant background thing like before. He wants a sequel that doesn't challenge him and doesn't make him think about all the scary time travel continuity stuff, which, as I've been showing, isn't nearly as complicated as this kind of fan would have you believe. And anyway, if something was important enough to you that you felt the need to complain about it on the internet, doesn't that prove that it matters? It clearly got a reaction out of you. You see a similar thing with how Sonic fans reacted to the whole Two Worlds thing, but that's its own video essay. The reality is, their reactions don't hinge on whether or not these things were always there, or if they were consequentially important. What these types of audiences aren't willing to admit is that they're automatically hostile to the mere concept of there being an overarching story in the first place.
I'm glad that Zelda, Ganon and Hyrule are all absent from Majora's Mask, because after Ocarina of Time, there was no need to revisit Hyrule and no story to be told there. Any direct sequel would need to be told somewhere else in order not to weaken the impact of the events in Ocarina.
One of the first things that I gained an appreciation for when I started this project is how humble Aonuma really is. This is how quote-unquote Zelda fans have been able to ignore him for so long, because he really lets the games speak for themselves. This is also the largest reason those other games are on the timeline. The 5 are the most important, but Aonuma didn't want his fellow artists to feel left out, and he wanted to share that victory. And that goes back to the whole thing with Fumito Ueda. Even though Ueda is a very small developer and his team is really small, it's heartwarming to know that a major first-party AAA series has such an explicit reference to him embedded in them, and it's one of the key things that I'm always going to point to in arguing that video games are capable of achieving narrative art.
Many champion Ico is a prime example of a game which is also a work of art, with some even saying it marks the moment where games started to embrace artistic qualities on par with other mediums. The truth, however, is that Ico is no more or less a work of art than Another World was 10 years before it. It's arguable which one is better, of course, but that's besides the point. They share so many similarities that calling one a work of art while dismissing the other would be ridiculous. Ueda didn't set out specifically to create a work of art because computer games are already inherently a form of art. Many game designers cite Ico as one of their favourite games, and if a lot of people gravitate towards something, inevitably some of them will misunderstand it, at least on some level. Sometimes it seems like the impression Ico has left on game designers is that subverting expectations or eschewing common design sensibilities automatically brings a game closer to being a piece of art. Ueda, however, understood when to use conventional elements, such as a final boss fight, to his advantage.
As of recording, it's still an ongoing debate, and this video certainly won't be the end of that discussion. If I'm lucky, this will be the start of one. But like I said, gamers aren't doing themselves any favors with this freedom, open world, gameplay first crap. They make it seem like in isolation that it's just a preference or whatever, but oh boy, it's not. It's an entire agenda. For a while they were calling it Zelda fatigue. If you've ever been creative or you respect creativity at all, the concept of something like Zelda fatigue should instantly offend you personally. Because if someone in the audience has fatigue, you know, maybe they should just take a break and do something else instead. You can just change the channel, dude. But what these gamers do is they use for fatigue to justify outrage that they know will get attention. I'm not going to say that Vinny is firmly a part of all that, but I'd be lying if I didn't say he at least flirts with the idea.
A lot of that stuff we just hadn't seen. Like Hyrule Field was considered like revolutionary at the time because of how massive it was. Now you look at it, it's like, what the fuck is there to do? Nothing to do, man! Not like Fortnite at all! It doesn't mean it's bad because Ocarina of Time kind of firmly established a formula, and I'm okay with the linearity as long as there's some freedom within that. I happen to think this game suffers in that regard because the sky feels so empty. So much potential for the sky segments, and they end up being just kind of adequate. Most of this game is pretty empty, on purpose.
Now, have I ever played a video game purely for fun? Of course I have. Have I ever stopped playing a game purely because I wasn't having fun? Yeah, it happens. But those are emotional reactions, and they're selfish reactions. A large constituency of gamers, including Vinny, don't seem to realize how dangerous this is.
You know, as a streamer, I like to think deeply about things.
We're on YouTube. We're not like musicians here, you know, like there's no problem.
What I've learned over the years as streaming has evolved is that we streamers are experts on a variety of topics. There's definitely stuff I would like different in the next Zelda. You know, me being smarter than Aonuma. We all are the best video game developers in our own heads, aren't we? But I do love the game, and it is the one I've had the most fun with. And what we like to do is talk about said topics with all the authority of an expert.
We're overestimating our importance in life and on the internet. We're just people that play video games and make YouTube videos. So, thank you very much.
And, you know, we do so responsibly and with tact. So, you know, as a streamer / expert, I'm telling you that ghosts can fucking time travel.
Vinny, you've built an entire career off playing video games on the internet. And again, you're not stupid. I know you're not. If this is something that's important to you, you need to sit up straight and act like it. Stop covering your ass, stop being ironic and self-deprecating, and just own it, man.
Isn't that rather a sentimental attitude about androids?
All this passion over a machine?
Don't start. This is important to me.
If we as gamers could never bridge the gap, if our culture continues to be one without conviction or loyalty, then we're just going to prove all the art nerds right when they say that video games aren't art or can't become art. We don't treat ourselves with respect, so we sure as hell don't deserve any from anyone else. It's the Tinkerbell effect. Video games have the potential to be art, but none of the artists involved are allowed to make anything personal because the studio cares more about their profit margins than they do about human expression. If you really want video games to be art, you have to fake it until you make it. No one's going to fight that fight for you. I certainly won't. I'm just some dishwasher who found a little free time after getting fired. You should be fighting for what video games could be rather than what they are now. The 5 Legend of Zelda titles that Eiji Aonuma directed aren't the pinnacle of game design. The only reason we can't do better than that is because we refuse to hold ourselves accountable, and not because they're great games, even though they absolutely are.
So that makes this the good shit. Sacred water. There is a 93% chance that that is the sacred water. Oh my god.
Then why are not all human officers required to have their eyes replaced with cybernetic implants?
Unblock me, bitch!